I am Aaliyah, 34 years old, and a senior forensic accountant. Before my sister's wedding, my parents handed me a laminated contract with 5 humiliating conditions I had to meet just to earn an invitation. They told me to comply or stay away, so I smiled, booked a first-class ticket to Malibu, and mailed one final wedding gift. When my sister opened it in front of hundreds of high society guests, her triumphant smile turned into a scream of pure terror. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled their perfect facade. Sunday dinners at the Capitol Grill in downtown Atlanta were a tradition my parents insisted upon whenever they wanted to project an image of undeniable wealth. My mother, Vivian, and my father, Reginald, loved the heavy mahogany tables, the low ambient lighting reflecting off crystal chandeliers, and the deferential waiters who catered to their every whim. They were obsessed with status, a lifelong obsession that had reached an unbearable fever pitch ever since my 29-year-old sister Jada got engaged to Preston. Preston was white, came from old New England money, and worked as a partner at an elite wealth management firm. To my parents, he was not just a future son-in-law. He was their golden ticket into a rarefied aristocratic circle they had desperately tried to infiltrate their entire lives. I sat across from them taking a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the familiar suffocating weight of my family dynamics pressing down on my chest. I had spent my entire adult life building a successful career entirely on my own, determined to escape the toxic environment of their sprawling suburban home. I paid my own way through Columbia University, while they poured all their financial resources into Jada. She was their unquestioned golden child, a woman who bounced from one expensive hobby to another without ever facing a single consequence. Now, sitting in the private dining room they had reserved specifically to impress Preston, I watched the three of them fawn over him. They laughed far too loud at his mediocre jokes and nodded enthusiastically at his arrogant, uneducated opinions on the current economic market. I remained quiet, focusing on my meal, knowing my presence was only tolerated because family optics demanded an illusion of complete unity. Then my mother reached into her designer handbag. Her manicured fingers pulled out a crisp white sheet of paper. The sheer absurdity of the moment hit me when I realized the paper was laminated. It gleamed under the warm restaurant lighting as she slid it across the polished wooden table directly in front of my plate. "I want to ensure we have a clear understanding before the wedding weekend," my mother said, her voice dropping into that syrupy, authoritative tone she used when she wanted to sound refined. "Jada and Preston are blending two very important families. We cannot afford any missteps, especially from you." I stared at the laminated document. The title read, "Wedding Attendance Agreement" in bold letters. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Those are the conditions for your attendance," my father interjected, cutting into his ribeye without even looking at me. "Read them. Accept them. Or do not bother showing up." I picked up the document. The sheer audacity of the printed words made the blood rush to my ears. There were 5 bullet points, each one a calculated insult designed to strip away my dignity and remind me of my place in their hierarchy. Condition 1 stated that I was required to pay the $50,000 catering overage. The text explicitly noted that since I maintained a single lifestyle without the financial burden of a husband or children, I had disposable income that should rightfully support my sister's milestone. They were actually demanding I fund a wedding I was barely welcome at. I thought about the grueling 60-hour weeks I worked at the firm, the late nights poring over complex financial audits, and the absolute audacity of them demanding the fruits of my labor to subsidize Jada's extravagant tastes. My father had the nerve to write that this was a small sacrifice for our family's ascension. I moved to condition 2, and the air left my lungs. Surrender. Big Mama's vintage diamond ring for resetting. Big Mama was our grandmother, the only person in this family who ever showed me unconditional love. When she passed away, she left her prized diamond ring to me because I was the one who sat by her hospital bed while Jada and my mother were away on a luxury shopping trip. Now the contract demanded I hand it over so Jada could reset the diamond to match Preston's country club aesthetic. They wanted to gut my only connection to my grandmother just to impress his wealthy relatives. Condition 3 demanded that I work as an unpaid behind-the-scenes coordinator for the entire wedding weekend. I was not to mingle with the guests or sit at the family tables. Instead, I was expected to manage the caterers, direct the florist, and handle any emergencies completely out of sight. They wanted to reduce a senior corporate accountant to unpaid help, ensuring I remained invisible while they paraded around playing royalty. The humiliation escalated with Condition 4. It explicitly required me to chemically straighten my natural hair so I would not ruin the visual harmony of the bridal party photos. My mother had always harbored deeply internalized racism, constantly criticizing my thick natural curls while praising Jada's expensive silky extensions. The contract stated my hair needed to look presentable and sophisticated for Preston's family, reducing my natural identity to an embarrassment that needed to be ironed away. Finally, I read Condition 5. It was a strict mandate to stay completely away from Preston's aristocratic parents. The document claimed my assertive attitude would be perceived as aggressive and would embarrass our family. It was the classic tired trope weaponized against me by my own blood. They were terrified that my habit of speaking my mind and refusing to be subservient would shatter the submissive, grateful image they were trying to project to their new white in-laws. I finished reading and slowly lowered the laminated paper to the table. The silence in the private dining room was heavy, broken only by the clinking of silverware. I looked up. Jada was sitting next to Preston, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. She was smirking, waiting for the predictable reaction. She expected me to cry, to argue, to plead for my place in the family, just like I used to do in our 20s, when I still craved their validation. She wanted a performance that proved she held all the power. Preston sat beside her with a condescending, privileged smile plastered across his face. He looked at me not as a future sister-in-law, but as a minor logistical problem that had just been successfully managed. He clearly viewed my submission as the necessary price of admission to his elite world. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes fixed on me with cold, unwavering expectation. "Well," she prompted impatiently, tapping her manicured nail against the table. "We need your verbal confirmation right now. The event planner is waiting to finalize the vendor payments tomorrow morning, and Preston's mother needs to know if she should cross you off the seating chart." A sudden, brilliant rush of clarity washed over me. For years, I had compromised my own self-respect to maintain a fragile, one-sided peace with people who viewed my independence as a threat and my success as a resource to be plundered. They had convinced themselves that my desire for a family connection was stronger than my basic human dignity. They were deeply, catastrophically wrong. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not shed a single tear of disappointment. I simply looked at the laminated list of demands, absorbing the profound disrespect printed on the page, and then looked at the smirking faces of my sister and her arrogant fiancé. Slowly, methodically, I reached across the pristine white tablecloth and wrapped my fingers firmly around the heavy, serrated handle of my steak knife. I let the silence hang for a moment, enjoying the sudden flicker of panic in my mother's eyes, as my fingers closed around the heavy silver handle of my steak knife. For a split second, Vivian actually held her breath, her rigid posture tightening even further, clearly terrified I might flip the table or cause the kind of scene she constantly accused me of making. Instead of giving her the satisfaction of my anger, I simply pressed the serrated edge into my medium rare ribeye and pulled it through the meat with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The sharp scrape of metal against porcelain echoed loudly in the private dining room, slicing right through the thick, suffocating tension they had built. My father could not handle the silence. Reginald leaned forward, his heavy hands planting firmly on either side of his plate, his voice booming with the manufactured authority he always used to intimidate his employees and his family alike. He demanded I drop the attitude immediately and stop being so difficult. He pointed a thick accusatory finger at me, stating that Preston's family, came from generations of untouched New England wealth, and this marriage was not just about Jada finding love. According to him, this wedding was a strategic alignment, a calculated elevation of our entire bloodline that would finally put us in the rooms we deserved to be in. He did not stop there. The resentment he had carried for over a decade finally spilled over onto the white tablecloth. Reginald decided this was the perfect moment to air out his oldest grievance. He loudly reminded everyone that while he was working himself to the bone, struggling to keep his independent car dealership from going under, I had selfishly packed my bags and run off to Columbia University. He spat the words, "corporate job," like they were a literal disease. He told me that a real daughter, a loyal daughter, would have brought her business degree back home to Atlanta to save her father's failing company. Instead, I had abandoned my own flesh and blood to collect a paycheck from a faceless white-owned firm. In his twisted mind, demanding $50,000 from me right now was not extortion. It was a mandatory tax for my disloyalty. He crossed his arms and declared that covering the catering overage for his golden child was the absolute least I could do to repay this family for my selfish independence. Before I could even process the sheer delusion of his monologue, Jada scoffed loudly. She tossed her long, perfectly styled silk press extensions over her shoulder and glared at me with absolute contempt. She told me I was just bitter. Her voice dripped with the kind of venom reserved only for sisters who know exactly where to slide the knife to inflict the most damage. She announced to the table that I was just acting out of pure jealousy because I was 34 years old, unmarried, and completely alone. She laughed a high, grating sound that bounced off the mahogany walls and said all my late nights at the office and that fancy Ivy League degree could not buy me a husband. She waved her massive engagement ring in my direction, the diamonds catching the chandelier light. She told me I was actively trying to ruin her perfect fairy tale because I knew deep down I would never get to wear a white dress myself. She said I was destined to be the rich, lonely aunt who nobody actually wanted around. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I did not give them the reaction they were practically begging for. I brought the piece of steak to my mouth, chewed methodically, and swallowed. I reached for my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth with precise movements, and looked directly into my sister's furious eyes. I kept my tone light and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather outside instead of dismantling a decade of family lies. I looked at Reginald and reminded him that my selfish corporate job, the one he despised so deeply, was the exact same job that kept his precious golden child out of bankruptcy court. I turned my gaze back to Jada and watched the color rapidly drain from her perfectly contoured face. I asked her if she wanted to explain to her future husband exactly how she managed to maintain her luxury lifestyle before he came along to fund it. I asked her if Preston knew about the $30,000 in secret credit card debt she had racked up buying designer bags and booking extravagant trips to Miami just to look rich on social media. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. Even Vivian stopped breathing. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, keeping my eyes locked on my sister as she began to tremble. I reminded her that 3 years ago, she showed up at my apartment in the middle of the night, sobbing uncontrollably because collection agencies were threatening to garnish her wages and ruin her life. I paid off every single cent of that $30,000 debt in one lump sum, so her pristine credit score would survive long enough for a man like Preston to propose. I pointed out that without my selfish corporate paycheck, Preston's family would have run a background check on her and found a massive financial liability instead of a high society bride. Jada opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She looked terrified, casting a panicked sideways glance at Preston, waiting for the inevitable explosion. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest, desperately trying to intervene, but the damage was already done. The perfect, flawless illusion they had spent the entire evening trying to maintain was fractured beyond repair. But Preston did not look angry at Jada. He did not look betrayed or shocked by the revelation of her massive hidden debt or her financial irresponsibility. Instead, he simply adjusted his tailored cuffs, his posture exuding centuries of unearned arrogance. He leaned in close to the table, resting his chin on his hands, and flashed a condescending, privileged smile that made my blood run cold. He looked at me with the absolute certainty of a man who believes the world and everyone in it belongs to him by right. He spoke with a slow, deliberate drawl, telling me that wealth was about understanding your place in the room. He said that $30,000 was nothing literal pocket change for people in his tax bracket. He stated that Jada belonged in his world because she understood how to play the game, how to adapt her personality, and how to look the part of a supportive partner. Then his pale blue eyes narrowed, stripping away the polite, refined facade he had worn all evening. He told me that if I could not afford the financial buy-in required to associate with his circle, and if I was too stubborn and aggressive to fall in line with his family's expectations, then I should just stay home. I looked at Preston, letting his words hang in the heavy air between us. He had delivered his ultimatum with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. My father nodded fervently from across the table, practically vibrating with approval at Preston putting me in my place. Reginald loved nothing more than seeing independent women brought to heel, especially his own daughter. My mother shot me a sharp warning glare, her eyes silently commanding me to fold, to apologize, to pull out my checkbook, and beg for the privilege of standing in the shadows at my sister's wedding. They all expected me to revert to the desperate approval-seeking girl I was in my 20s. The girl who would swallow any insult, pay any price, and diminish her own light just to be included in the annual family holiday photos. They thought my need for a family was stronger than my need for basic self-respect. I did not fold. I uncurled my fingers from the heavy silver handle of the steak knife and placed the blade gently on the edge of my porcelain plate. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud over the soft jazz playing through the restaurant speakers. I reached forward and picked up the laminated wedding attendance agreement. The glossy plastic felt slick and offensive against my fingertips. My mother leaned back in her leather chair, a triumphant gleam returning to her eyes, fully expecting me to slide the insulting document into my designer purse and capitulate to their outrageous demands. Instead, I gripped the thick paper with both hands. I locked eyes with Jada, whose smirk was completely frozen in place, and I twisted my wrists sharply. The heavy lamination resisted, for a fraction of a second, fighting back before snapping with a loud, aggressive crack. I tore the document cleanly down the middle, ripping right through the paragraph demanding $50,000 of my hard-earned money. My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that caught in her throat. She immediately darted her panicked eyes toward the adjacent tables, terrified that someone in the Capitol Grill was witnessing this unforgivable breach of high society decorum. Vivian cared more about the opinions of strangers eating sea bass 50 feet away than the psychological well-being of her eldest daughter. Reginald slammed his heavy fist onto the mahogany table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle violently against each other. He demanded to know what on earth I thought I was doing, his face flushing with rapid rising anger. I did not answer him. I did not stop. I placed the torn halves of the contract together and ripped them again with pure, calculated force, destroying the bullet point demanding my grandmother's vintage diamond ring. I tore it again, destroying the mandate to chemically straighten my natural hair. I reduced their pathetic list of demands to absolute garbage. Without breaking eye contact with my furious father, I dropped the shredded plastic and paper directly into my crystal water glass. The ice clinked softly as the ruined contract bobbed to the surface, the dark ink instantly blurring and bleeding underneath the cold water. Jada shrieked, her voice pitching up into genuine outrage, slamming her palms on the table. She called me a psycho and demanded I leave the restaurant before I ruined her perfect dinner any further. She looked at her ruined contract floating in the water like I had just destroyed a sacred religious text. I decided to do exactly what she asked. I calmly pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my tailored pencil skirt. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it onto the center of the table. It fluttered down, landing right next to Jada's untouched plate of asparagus. I told Reginald that the cash should more than cover the cost of my sparkling water and the few bites of steak I had managed to stomach before losing my appetite. I told him to keep the change, pointing out that since his dealership was bleeding cash and struggling to make payroll, he clearly needed the charity far more than I did. Reginald's face turned a violent shade of purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his starched collar. He opened his mouth, but before he could unleash whatever vicious tirade he was formulating, I shifted my attention entirely to Preston. He was still sitting there, attempting to maintain that mask of bored aristocratic superiority, watching me like a feral animal that had just acted out in his pristine environment. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, my footsteps measured and deliberate until I was standing directly beside his chair. I could smell the sharp, woody notes of his expensive cologne, but I could also sense the sudden metallic spike of fear radiating from him when he realized I was not retreating from his earlier threat. Preston tried to lean away from me, maintaining his posture, but I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from his ear so no one else at the table could hear what I was about to say. I did not yell. I did not sound angry or unhinged. I used my absolute best corporate boardroom voice, the cold, clinical tone I reserved for dismantling fraudulent corporate ledgers and presenting devastating audit results to cornered executives. I whispered 3 words: double Irish Dutch sandwich. I paused for just a second, letting the highly specific, highly illegal offshore asset shielding term sink deep into his brain. Then I added the exact name of the shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company I had noticed during a routine cross-referencing audit at my firm weeks ago. A massive, unregulated shell company directly linked to his elite wealth management firm, a firm that prided itself on clean generational wealth. I pulled back just enough to watch his physical transformation. It was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Preston's smug, condescending smile vanished, completely wiped away, as if it had never existed. The blood drained from his face so rapidly his skin took on a sickening, translucent pallor. His jaw went slack, and his pale blue eyes blew wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He stopped breathing entirely, his chest frozen mid-inhale. The man who had just told me I did not belong in his world suddenly looked like a man who realized his world was about to collapse around him. He knew exactly what that term meant, and he knew exactly what that shell company held. He realized in that agonizing second that I was not just a sister-in-law to be bullied into submission. I was a senior forensic accountant who held the keys to his complete financial destruction. I did not wait for him to recover his voice. I did not look back at my mother's horrified face, my father's boiling rage, or my sister's utter confusion regarding what I had just said to her paralyzed fiancé. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room. The steady, confident click of my heels echoed down the carpeted hallway as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the warm Atlanta night. I left my family sitting behind me in a stunned, furious, and highly compromised silence, taking my very first breath of real freedom. The morning sun glared fiercely through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office in downtown Atlanta. But the warmth did nothing to thaw the cold, mechanical focus settling in my chest. I sat in my ergonomic chair, sipping black coffee, staring blindly at the complex financial models spread across my dual monitors. The adrenaline and the chaos from the restaurant the night before had completely faded, leaving behind a razor-sharp, crystalline clarity. I had finally done it. I had pushed back. My desk phone shrilled, shattering the quiet hum of the air conditioning. The digital caller ID flashed my father's name, Reginald. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, steady breath, centering myself in my professional environment before picking up the receiver. He did not bother with a greeting. The moment the line connected, his voice exploded through the speaker, thick with the kind of volatile rage he usually reserved for incompetent mechanics at his dealership or vendors who demanded payment. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, malicious embarrassment to the family name, shouting that if I did not wire the $50,000 for the catering overage by noon, I would be dead to him. He called my behavior at the Capitol Grill psychotic and declared with immense theatricality that I was officially permanently disowned. He barked that I was strictly prohibited from attending the wedding, warning me that my invitation was revoked, my seat at the table erased, and my presence no longer tolerated by anyone in our bloodline. And then he delivered what he genuinely believed was his ultimate devastating death blow. He proudly announced that he was calling his attorney this very morning to explicitly cut me out of his will, ensuring I would never see a single dime of his legacy. He stopped talking. Through the receiver, I could hear his heavy, labored breathing. He was waiting. He was waiting for the familiar sound of my voice cracking. He was waiting for the tears, the frantic apologies, the desperate begging that used to inevitably follow his aggressive ultimatums. He was using the exact same emotional terrorism he had deployed when I was 19, when he threatened to pull my co-signer status on my student loans because I refused to quit my summer internship to work the reception desk at his dealership for free. Back then, I had panicked. I had cried. I had folded to his will. Today, the silence stretched out cold and entirely unyielding. I took another slow sip of my coffee. "Are you listening to me?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous gravelly register. "You are cut off. You get nothing." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass surface of my desk. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotional fuel he could feed on. I told him that I heard every single word. Then I methodically dismantled his lifelong delusions. I reminded Reginald that I was a senior corporate forensic accountant at one of the top financial firms in the country. I stated clearly and without arrogance that my annual base salary, not even factoring in my quarterly performance bonuses, was exactly triple the net profit his dealership had reported to the IRS last year. I reminded him that I had already seen his books when he begged me to do his corporate taxes for free 2 years ago. I heard a sharp, involuntary intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I did not stop. I addressed the looming threat of his precious will. I told him the brutal truth. I reminded him that his estate consisted of a severely leveraged, heavily mortgaged suburban house that required 2 more refinances just to keep the lights on, and a failing automotive business currently drowning in high-interest inventory debt. I explained that I had absolutely no desire to inherit his compounding financial liabilities. I told him that his grand gesture of disownment was not a punishment, it was a profound, overdue relief. Before he could recover from the shock of my utter indifference, before he could launch into another screaming fit to desperately reclaim his shattered authority, I simply wished him a good morning and placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The click was loud, final, and incredibly satisfying. Less than 30 seconds later, my personal cell phone lit up on my desk. It was Jada. She did not call. She sent voice notes, 3 of them arriving in rapid, aggressive succession. I tapped play on the first one, letting the audio fill my quiet office. She was not just angry, she was entirely hysterical. Her voice screeched through the speaker, calling me a bitter, jealous spinster who was deliberately trying to sabotage her fairy tale because my own life was a lonely, miserable failure. The second voice note was pure venom. She threatened that if I even thought about coming within a mile of her exclusive country club venue, she would have me humiliated and arrested. She boasted that she had already given the head of the private security team a printed photograph of my face, with strict, non-negotiable instructions to physically drag me off the premises and throw me onto the street if I showed up. She wanted me to know that I was nothing to her now, just a crazy, estranged relative who could not handle her sudden elevation in social status. The third voice note was the most revealing. Her tone shifted abruptly from screaming rage to a frantic, breathless panic. She said Preston was furious. She said his family's legal team was ruthless, and that if I ever spoke to him again, if I ever brought up whatever crazy, nonsensical financial terms I had whispered to him at the restaurant, they would sue me for defamation, ruin my professional reputation, and destroy my career. She commanded me to keep my mouth shut and stay out of their lives forever. I listened as the messages ended, the quiet, ambient noise rushing back into my office. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not try to defend myself or argue with her manufactured delusions. I simply opened her contact profile, hit block caller, and set the phone face down on the glass. I swiveled my chair back to face my dual monitors. Jada genuinely thought she was protecting a wealthy, aristocratic fiancé from a jealous, unhinged sister. But I knew exactly what I had seen last night. Preston's reaction at the restaurant was not the righteous indignation of an innocent upper-class gentleman being harassed by crazy in-laws. It was visceral, primal fear. It was the absolute paralyzing terror of a man who realized his darkest, most tightly guarded secrets were suddenly walking around in the light of day. Innocent men do not stop breathing when you casually mention a specific corporate structure and a Cayman Islands shell company. Innocent men do not have their fiancés threaten defamation lawsuits before any actual accusations have even been made public. I reached out and closed out my regular daily workflow. I minimized the massive spreadsheets for the corporate merger I was supposed to be auditing this morning. My fingers flew across my mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet room. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged directly into the firm's restricted, encrypted global background database. It was a powerful tool, a digital skeleton key designed exclusively for high-level forensic investigators to trace hidden assets, uncover masked corporate ownerships, and follow the invisible flow of illicit money across international borders. My family had uninvited me, disowned me, and ordered me to stay away from their precious elite golden boy. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded me to protect their fragile illusion of wealth. But as I typed Preston's full legal name into the search query bar, a cold, relentless determination settled over me. I pressed enter. It was time to peel back the pristine high society layers of my future brother-in-law. It was time to look into the dirt and see exactly what kind of monster my parents were so desperate to invite into our bloodline. The restricted database screen glared back at me, an expanse of raw data and encrypted corporate filings just waiting to be cracked open. As the loading bar inched forward, chewing through the pristine public relations facade of Preston's wealth management firm, I picked up my cell phone. Unraveling the financial life of a high-profile executive required more than just my forensic accounting skills. It required airtight legal privilege and someone who hated arrogant men just as much as I did. I bypassed my usual workflow and dialed Kendra. She was not just my best friend from our days surviving cramped dorm rooms at Columbia University. She was a senior corporate attorney whose entire career was built on dismantling fraudulent executives and tearing apart illegal contracts. When I told her I needed an emergency meeting under attorney-client privilege, she did not ask questions. Within 10 minutes, we were sealed securely inside Conference Room 4, a soundproof glass box perched on the 40th floor of my firm's high-rise building, completely isolated from the bustling corporate floor below. Kendra marched in, carrying 2 black coffees and a thick legal pad, dropping them onto the center of the cold marble table. She dropped into the leather chair beside me, crossing her arms, and demanded to know what kind of catastrophic disaster warranted pulling her out of a mandatory deposition review. I did not hold back. I gave her the exact, unfiltered rundown of the disastrous Sunday dinner at the Capitol Grill. I detailed the humiliating laminated contract, my mother's desperation to appease her future white in-laws, my father's screaming phone call that morning, and Jada's unhinged, threatening voice notes. Kendra listened with a look of growing disgust. But when I told her about my final move, about leaning down and dropping the specific name of a Cayman Islands shell company directly into Preston's ear, she stopped writing. She let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the soundproof glass. "You absolutely terrified him," she said, a wicked smile spreading across her face. I took a sip of my black coffee and nodded, telling her that the color drained out of his face so fast I thought he was going to pass out right there into his expensive steak. Through our rapid-fire dialogue, we began to dissect exactly who Preston was beneath his custom-tailored suits and his manufactured aristocratic pedigree. We traded memories of his endless passive-aggressive behavior, validating every suspicion I had ever harbored about him. Kendra reminded me of the engagement party 6 months ago, where Preston cornered me by the bar and spent 20 agonizing minutes explaining basic capital gains tax brackets to me. He spoke slowly, using small words completely intentionally, ignoring the fact that I held a master's degree in accounting and handled accounts worth 10 times his entire firm's portfolio. I brought up the time he visited my luxury condo in the Buckhead district. He had stood by my floor-to-ceiling windows, looked out at the pristine high-security neighborhood, and loudly wondered how I managed to afford the mortgage on a single income. It was a thinly veiled, deeply racist microaggression, implying that a successful Black woman owning premium real estate, without a handout or a wealthy husband, was some sort of statistical anomaly he could not comprehend. Preston constantly made sly, degrading comments about my career, dismissing my grueling forensic work as the job of a simple corporate drone, while elevating his own job as visionary wealth creation. He desperately needed to assert his intellectual and social dominance over me at every single family gathering. My sheer existence, my unapologetic independence, and my refusal to fawn over his family name threatened his fragile superiority complex. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just an angry, bitter sister-in-law he could bully into submission. I turned my attention back to my laptop and synced my screen directly to the massive smartboard mounted on the conference room wall. The restricted database had finished compiling the raw data on his firm's sterling heritage wealth. I pulled up the master file. At first glance, the public filings looked exactly as Preston always described them to my parents. The documents painted a picture of a pristine, highly exclusive old money financial institution that only catered to the absolute elite. But I was not looking at the glossy public relations brochures or the carefully curated website. I was looking at the raw, unedited corporate structure operating behind the curtain. Kendra stood up, walking closer to the glowing screen, her trained legal eyes immediately tracking the complex web of holding companies and subsidiaries. She tapped the glass with her pen, her expression turning deadly serious. "Sterling Heritage is not a single unified financial entity," she said, her voice dropping into her professional legal tone. "It is a labyrinth." She was right. The deeper we dug into the public filings and corporate registrations, the more the illusion shattered. Preston's firm was structured like a Russian nesting doll of limited liability companies. We identified shell company after shell company, each one owning a fraction of the other, creating a deliberate, convoluted legal maze designed specifically to obscure the true owner of the assets. We followed the digital paper trail as it moved money out of domestic American accounts, filtering it through a series of anonymous LLCs registered in the lenient tax havens of Delaware and Nevada. From there, the money did not go into legitimate investment portfolios. The funds were funneled directly offshore, routed seamlessly into the exact Cayman Islands shell company I had whispered to him at the restaurant. I sat back down at my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys as I pulled up the firm's boasted quarterly returns. Preston had spent the last 2 years bragging relentlessly to my father about how his exclusive proprietary portfolio consistently delivered 22% annual returns. He used those numbers to manipulate Reginald and Vivian, convincing them that he was an unparalleled financial genius, operating on a level they could barely comprehend. He promised them that associating with his family would guarantee them generational wealth. I ran his reported returns through a sophisticated stress test algorithm on my secondary monitor. I isolated the specific asset classes his firm claimed to hold and cross-referenced them against the real-time historical market performance of those exact sectors over the past 36 months. The computer fan whirred as it processed thousands of data points comparing Preston's boastful promises against cold, hard economic reality. The progress bar on my algorithm hit 100%. A series of glaring red discrepancies flooded the smartboard, illuminating the conference room with the undeniable proof of his deception. The silence between Kendra and me became absolute. I looked at the glowing red numbers, and Kendra looked back at me, both of us recognizing the exact terrifying shape of the monster hiding in the data. The numbers simply did not add up. He was not beating the market. He was not outsmarting global economic trends. The algorithm proved that the yield he claimed to be generating required a sustained, miraculous level of growth that had not existed in those specific financial sectors for over a decade. Every single percentage point he bragged about was a complete fabrication, a phantom number generated to keep his investors blindly pouring their capital into his Cayman labyrinth. The massive returns Preston was boasting about, to my parents the immense wealth he used to justify his arrogant, untouchable behavior, were mathematically impossible in the current market. The algorithm finalized its stress test, painting the glass walls of the conference room in a harsh, unforgiving red glow. I stared at the cascading columns of deficit, my forensic accounting instincts kicking into absolute overdrive. Kendra leaned heavily over my shoulder, her breath catching as she read the gross mathematical disparities flashing across my dual monitors. Preston was not an investment savant. He was not the heir to untouchable generational New England wealth. He was a highly charismatic, impeccably dressed parasite running a sophisticated modern-day Ponzi scheme. I opened a new terminal window and initiated a deep dive forensic trace on the firm's operational cash flow. I bypassed the encrypted firewalls of his Cayman holding companies, pulling the raw ledger data directly onto the massive smartboard mounted on the wall. Kendra and I stood side by side, watching the money move in real time. It was a textbook, albeit dazzlingly complex, fraudulent loop. Preston was not trading assets funding startups or generating legitimate yields in any known market. He was entirely reliant on hunting for fresh capital. He was using the massive influx of cash from new desperate investors to pay off the exorbitant dividends he had promised the old ones, while simultaneously skimming a massive unregulated management fee right off the top to fund his own lavish lifestyle and maintain his aristocratic facade. He was entirely liquid, entirely fake, and currently bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. The data showed that his initial investors, likely old money families he had actually managed to con years ago, were getting spooked by domestic market volatility. They were submitting formal requests to withdraw their capital, demanding the massive payouts he had guaranteed. His entire house of cards was actively, violently collapsing under the weight of its own deception. Kendra began pacing the length of the soundproof room, her legal mind already calculating the federal prison sentences attached to each wire fraud violation we uncovered. She pointed her pen at the screen, noting that a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude required a constant, massive injection of fresh blood just to keep the lights on and stop the Securities and Exchange Commission from kicking down his mahogany office doors. We needed to see who was keeping the sinking ship afloat. We needed to identify his newest marks. I highlighted the most recent capital injections, isolating the emergency funds that had somehow kept Sterling Heritage Wealth solvent over the last 90 days. I filtered the inbound wire transfers, methodically tracing the routing numbers backward from the offshore Cayman accounts to their domestic origins. The screen populated with a series of massive staggered deposits: 500,000, 800,000, 1.2 million. The sheer volume of cash moving into his fraudulent accounts was staggering. Kendra stopped pacing. She leaned in close to the monitor and told me to unmask the routing numbers. I typed the decryption sequence, stripping away the final layers of banking privacy. The domestic bank accounts materialized on the screen. The names associated with those accounts flashed in bold, unforgiving black text: Reginald and Vivian. A cold, heavy silence descended on the conference room. My hands hovered perfectly still over the mechanical keyboard. I stared at my parents' names. The very people who had just publicly disowned me, screamed at me, and thrown me out of their lives for refusing to pay a $50,000 catering bill. They were the fresh blood. They were the desperate, ignorant marks Preston was bleeding dry to save himself from federal indictment. I ran a rapid, ruthless cross-referencing audit on their specific account numbers, matching them against municipal property records and national banking databases. The reality of their financial destruction unspooled across my monitors with terrifying clarity. Preston had not just brought my parents on as exclusive clients. He had methodically, deliberately gutted them, The digital records showed that exactly 4 months ago, aligning perfectly with the timeline of Jada and Preston announcing their engagement, Reginald and Vivian had quietly taken out a massive predatory mortgage on their sprawling, previously paid-off suburban estate. But they did not stop at leveraging their home. The records indicated a complete, heavily penalized liquidation of my father's entire 401k and my mother's long-term retirement portfolios. They had taken every single cent of real tangible wealth they had accumulated over 40 years of marriage, stripped it of all its protective equity, and handed it directly to a charlatan in a custom suit. The motivation was painfully, tragically obvious. They did it to fund Jada's obscene, limitless wedding budget. They did it to purchase the designer dresses, the imported European floral arrangements, the private caterers, and the elite country club venue. They were desperate to prove to Preston's phantom aristocratic family that they belonged in his inner circle. And whatever was left over, whatever millions they had managed to scrape together by leveraging their entire existence, they had enthusiastically handed over to Preston's exclusive management portfolio. They were completely blinded by his promises of guaranteed exponential returns and the allure of generational wealth. They genuinely thought they were buying their way into the absolute upper echelon of society. They thought they were securing a legacy that would elevate our bloodline forever. Instead, they had eagerly bankrolled their own financial execution. Kendra let out a low, disbelieving breath, her eyes locked on the zero balances in my parents' traditional savings accounts. She whispered that they had handed a drowning man their only life preserver. I pulled up the amortization schedules and the upcoming balloon payments for my father's new high-interest mortgage, placing them side by side with the rapidly depleting operational accounts of Preston's shell company. The timeline for their survival was brutally, shockingly short. Without another massive, immediate injection of cash, Preston's firm would completely default. The data projected a total collapse in exactly 3 weeks. The moment he went under, the moment the federal authorities froze his assets, the bank would move to seize my parents' home. Their retirement was already gone. Their cash reserves were completely empty. The man they had worshipped, the man they had viciously chosen over their own flesh and blood, had pushed them right to the absolute edge of the abyss. They were weeks away from total, irreversible bankruptcy, and as they sat in their empty, mortgaged mansion planning a high-society wedding, they did not even know it yet. Kendra stared at the glaring red numbers on the smartboard, shaking her head in sheer disbelief at the magnitude of the financial crater we had just uncovered. Preston had not just scammed my parents, he had led them to the absolute edge of a financial cliff and convinced them to jump. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest as I processed the reality that Vivian and Reginald had eagerly traded their entire life savings for a front-row seat at a fraudulent wedding. I needed a physical break from the digital carnage. I told Kendra I was heading down to the ground floor atrium to grab a black coffee and clear my head before we began the tedious process of drafting the formal fraud report for the federal authorities. Our firm occupies the top 30 floors of a monolithic glass and steel tower in the financial district. The ground floor lobby is a cavernous, intimidating expanse of imported white Italian marble, brushed steel pillars, and a massive circular security desk manned by highly trained, no-nonsense personnel. It is a space designed to project quiet authority and utter security. As the silver doors of the elevator slid open, that hushed professional atmosphere was completely shattered. I heard the sharp, unmistakable shriek of my sister's voice bouncing aggressively off the high vaulted ceilings. Jada was standing at the main security checkpoint, wearing a violently pink, entirely inappropriate designer dress, screaming at a bewildered guard who was actively refusing her entry without an access badge. Preston stood a few paces behind her, shifting uncomfortably on his expensive leather shoes. Jada spotted me stepping off the elevator. She immediately shoved past the security desk, completely ignoring the guard's sharp command to stop, and marched across the polished marble with the heavy stomping gait of an enraged toddler. She closed the distance between us and launched into a full-volume, unhinged verbal assault. She did not care that senior partners visiting corporate executives and entire legal teams were stopping in their tracks, their briefcases in hand, to watch the spectacle unfold. She screamed that I was a pathetic, bitter spinster. She projected her voice so it carried across the entire atrium, declaring that my grueling career was nothing but a sad, miserable substitute for the fact that I could not secure a husband. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, shouting that I was dedicating my lonely life to ruining her perfect fairy tale, simply because no man would ever look at me the way Preston looked at her. Her voice echoed terribly, turning the pristine corporate lobby into her own personal reality television set. She called me jealous. She called me a failure. She demanded to know who I thought I was to disrespect her wealthy fiancé at a high society dinner. I stood perfectly still. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely neutral, letting her exhaust her vocal cords and make an absolute fool of herself in front of my colleagues. I did not flinch, and I did not interrupt. When she finally realized I was not reacting to her venom, her unhinged anger morphed into a smug, vindictive triumph. She thrust her open palm just inches from my face. She demanded I hand over Big Mama's ring. Right then, right there in the middle of the lobby. She proudly announced to everyone within earshot that Vivian had visited the family attorney at 9 o'clock this morning. Our mother had officially legally transferred the ownership of our late grandmother's vintage diamond ring directly to Jada. It was a calculated, malicious strike explicitly designed as a punishment. Vivian wanted to inflict maximum emotional pain for my disobedience at the restaurant, stripping me of the only family heirloom I had ever cherished. Jada snapped her fingers in my face, ordering me to open my bag and surrender the property immediately before she instructed the building security guards to arrest me for theft. I did not look at Jada's outstretched hand. I did not acknowledge her petty, cruel demand. Instead, I looked past her shoulder directly at Preston. The transformation was absolute and pathetic. He was not looking at Jada, and he was certainly not looking at me. His pale, panicked eyes were darting frantically around the cavernous lobby. He was staring at the imposing brushed steel logo of our forensic accounting firm mounted on the wall above the reception desk. He was tracking the thick black domes of the high-definition corporate security cameras mounted on every single structural pillar. He was watching the security guards who had stepped out from behind their desk, their hands resting on their utility belts as they spoke urgently into their lapel microphones, preparing to intervene. Preston knew exactly where he was standing. He recognized the name of my firm on the wall. He knew this specific building housed the most ruthless corporate investigators, tax attorneys and forensic auditors on the Eastern Seaboard. He knew this was the exact institution that routinely dismantled offshore shell companies and handed the evidence over to the federal government. He realized he had willingly walked right into the belly of the beast. Preston grabbed Jada by the elbow. His grip was entirely devoid of his usual manufactured affection. It was a harsh, panicked clamp. He yanked her arm down, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic hiss. He begged her to lower her voice. He ordered her to stop screaming immediately. Jada tried to yank her arm away, confused and deeply irritated by his sudden lack of support. She tried to raise her voice again to demand the ring, but Preston squeezed tighter, his knuckles turning white. He was sweating profusely, the moisture bleeding right through the collar of his custom silk shirt. He pulled her backward, toward the revolving glass doors, terrified that every single word she screamed was being recorded by the cameras and echoing off the marble walls of the exact institution that currently held the absolute mathematical proof of his impending federal crimes. Jada ripped her arm out of Preston's grasp with a violent, erratic jerk, her acrylic nails scraping harshly against the fine fabric of his tailored suit. She was entirely oblivious to his rising, suffocating panic and completely blind to the heavily surveilled corporate environment surrounding us. She stepped right back into my personal space, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a toxic mixture of entitlement and rage. She planted her hands on her hips, striking a pose she had undoubtedly perfected in front of her bedroom mirror. "I am not leaving this building without that ring," she shrieked, her voice cracking as it bounced off the imported Italian marble walls. Mama went to her lawyer this morning. She signed the papers. The ring is legally mine. Hand it over right now, or I swear I will have these security guards arrest you for grand larceny. I did not flinch. I took a single deliberate step forward, the sharp click of my heel sounding like a gavel striking a sounding block in the hushed, cavernous lobby. Every senior partner, every junior associate, and every visiting executive in the atrium had stopped dead in their tracks, watching the spectacle unfold. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands loosely clasped in front of me, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. I looked directly into Jada's flushed, contorted face. Vivian cannot legally transfer the ownership of property she does not possess, I stated. My voice was pitched at a calm conversational volume, yet it cut through the heavy silence of the room with razor-sharp precision. Big Mama was entirely aware of exactly who her daughter was. She knew Vivian would eventually try to leverage her assets to fund her desperate social climbing. Big Mama was not a fool. I watched the smug certainty begin to drain from Jada's eyes as I delivered the cold facts. 3 years before she died, Big Mama had a private meeting with her estate attorney. She drafted a handwritten, fully notarized will, and she filed it securely with his office. She explicitly, intentionally bypassed Vivian and left that vintage diamond ring directly to me. Vivian's little morning trip to her lawyer was nothing but a performative, legally meaningless tantrum designed to make you feel special. Jada stared at me, her mouth opening and closing in rapid succession. The absolute, unshakable certainty in my voice completely dismantled her fabricated claim. The illusion of her triumphant morning, the false narrative Vivian had fed her to punish me, shattered into a million useless pieces. The color rushed to her face, a mottled, angry red that clashed horribly with the violently pink fabric of her inappropriate designer dress. The facade of the elegant, poised bride to be instantly vanished. The dam finally broke. Years of carefully concealed bitterness, toxic resentment, and profound, deep-seated insecurity violently erupted right there in the middle of my firm's lobby. "You think you are so untouchable," she screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch flecks of spit flying from her trembling lips. "You have always thought you were better than me, ever since we were kids." She threw her hands in the air, gesturing wildly at the towering glass windows surrounding us. "Just because you got that shiny acceptance letter to Columbia University and I got rejected. You think your fancy degrees make you superior to everyone else in this family. You think your little corporate job makes you special. But look at you. You are miserable. You are nothing but a lonely, bitter calculator. You sit in this sterile, depressing building crunching numbers for strangers while I am marrying into an actual dynasty. You are actively trying to sabotage my wedding because you know no man is ever going to want you." I listened to her unravel, absorbing every vicious, desperate word. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of my younger sister. She had built her entire existence, her entire sense of self-worth around securing male validation and bathing in our parents' blatant favoritism. My independence, my grueling education, my ability to exist and thrive completely outside of her shallow, materialistic value system utterly terrified her. She desperately needed me to be miserable to justify her own empty choices. She needed me to be a failure so she could finally feel like a success. I did not match her chaotic, desperate energy. I did not raise my voice to aggressively defend my life, my highly lucrative career, or my profound personal happiness. I knew the power of absolute composure, especially as a Black woman standing in the center of a predominantly white corporate fortress. I simply turned my head and looked at the chief of security, a towering, broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who had been waiting patiently for my signal. I gave him a single subtle nod. Marcus and 2 other heavily built guards stepped forward with practiced military precision. They immediately flanked Jada and Preston, their imposing physical presence creating an undeniable wall of authority. "Ma'am, sir, it is time for you to vacate the premises," Marcus stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that brooked absolutely no argument. "You are actively trespassing, and you are disturbing our corporate operations. Walk to the revolving doors right now, or you will be physically restrained and immediately handed over to local law enforcement." Preston finally found his voice. He plastered on his manufactured, arrogant smirk, desperately trying to salvage whatever aristocratic dignity he had left in a room full of actual legitimate financial power players. He aggressively adjusted the knot of his silk tie, completely refusing to make eye contact with the towering security guards. "We are leaving," he announced loudly, aiming his voice at the crowd of mesmerized onlookers rather than addressing me. "We should not lower ourselves to engaging with this pathetic level of unprofessionalism, Jada. We have an elite wedding to plan. Let your sister rot in this miserable cubicle farm." He turned sharply on his expensive leather heel, grabbing Jada's hand with a punishing grip to pull her aggressively toward the exit. He wanted to leave with the final word. He wanted to strut out of the building on his own manufactured terms, pretending he was completely above the fray. I was absolutely not going to let him escape that easily. I walked calmly over to the massive curved marble reception desk. I opened the thick manila folder I had been holding firmly at my side. I slid out a single freshly printed piece of paper containing the exact offshore routing numbers and the catastrophic negative balances of his fraudulent Cayman shell companies. I folded the document perfectly in half. The heavy premium cardstock made a crisp, satisfying sound as I creased it. I placed it flat on the cool marble counter and pushed it firmly across the sleek surface until it hovered right at the edge, directly in Preston's exit path. "Preston," I called out. My voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable lethal command that stopped him dead in his tracks. He froze completely, unable to resist the pull of his own fragile ego. He looked back over his tailored shoulder, his pale eyes locking onto mine. I pointed to the folded piece of paper resting on the marble. "Take this with you," I said, my expression devoid of any mercy. "Consider it an early wedding gift." Preston stopped. The heavy glass revolving doors were less than 20 feet away, promising a quick escape into the bustling city streets, but his ego anchored him to the marble floor. He could not walk away from a direct challenge, especially not one delivered with such quiet, absolute certainty. He slowly turned around, his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly against the polished stone. Jada yanked on his arm, her face still a mask of violently pink rage. She demanded to know what he was doing, insisting that they did not have time to entertain my pathetic games. Preston ignored her. His eyes remained locked on the folded piece of premium cardstock resting on the edge of the security desk. He walked back toward me, projecting a false air of aristocratic boredom, as if he were humoring a subordinate. He reached out and picked up the paper. He unfolded it with a sharp, arrogant flick of his wrist. I watched his eyes scan the top line of the document. I watched the exact second his brain processed the alphanumeric codes. It took less than 3 seconds for the immaculate, untouchable facade of Preston Sterling to completely and utterly shatter. The document he was holding was not a generic corporate printout or a meaningless threat. It was a highly classified, heavily redacted wire transfer record. It was a digital death warrant. The top half of the page detailed the exact catastrophic liquidation of Reginald and Vivian's entire life savings. It listed the precise dollar amounts pulled from my father's 401k and the recently finalized predatory mortgage on their family estate. But the bottom half of the page was the true weapon. The forensic trace mapped the illegal movement of my parents' newly acquired capital. It showed the money bypassing his supposed high-yield investment portfolios entirely. Instead, the document illustrated the funds flowing directly into a heavily obscured offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that I had explicitly identified on the paper as a known clearinghouse for settling massive unregulated international gambling debts. Preston stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly gray pallor beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the lobby. The paper began to tremble violently in his hands. He looked up at me, and for the first time since he had embedded himself into my family, There was no condescension in his eyes. There was only pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant aristocrat was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate con artist who suddenly realized the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. He had spent months treating me like a bitter, jealous sister-in-law, an annoying obstacle to be mocked and dismissed. He had loudly diminished my grueling corporate career, reducing my master's degree in accounting to the work of a lonely calculator. Now, standing in the heart of my financial fortress, the terrifying reality crashed down on him. I was not a simple corporate drone. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I had just dismantled his entire meticulously constructed life of lies during a 15-minute coffee break. I held the absolute, indisputable proof of his federal wire fraud, his embezzlement, and his impending financial ruin right in the palm of my hand. Jada, completely oblivious to the radioactive nature of the document in her fiancé's trembling hands, misinterpreted his stunned silence. She scoffed loudly, stepping up beside him and leaning in to look at the paper. "Is that an apology?" Jada demanded, her voice dripping with misplaced triumph. "Did she actually write a check for the caterer? Because if she thinks a few $1,000s is going to make up for the disrespect she showed my future mother-in-law, she is completely delusional. Hand it here, Preston. Let me see how much she wrote it for." She reached for the document. Preston reacted with the pure, violent instinct of a trapped animal. He did not gently pull the paper away. He crushed it into a tight, crumpled ball in his fist, pulling it entirely out of her reach. He turned to Jada, his eyes wide and wild, the sweat now visibly beading on his forehead and rolling down his neck, soaking the collar of his silk shirt. "We are leaving," Preston commanded. His voice was no longer a smooth, cultured baritone. It was a ragged, breathless rasp. Jada blinked, genuinely startled by his harsh tone. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her anger instantly flaring back to life. "I am not leaving here until she hands over Big Mama's ring. Vivian said it belongs to me. She is a thief. I am calling the police right now." "Shut your mouth and walk," Preston hissed, his voice trembling with unchecked panic. He did not argue. He did not attempt to soothe her bruised ego or play the role of the protective, wealthy partner. He lunged forward and grabbed Jada by the upper arm. His grip was brutal, completely devoid of any affection. His fingers dug deeply into her flesh, locking around her bicep like a vice. Jada gasped in shock, stumbling forward as he physically yanked her toward the exit. "Let go of me!" she yelled, her acrylic nails clawing uselessly at his hand. "You are hurting me. Preston, stop it. I want the ring." He did not look back at me. He did not look at the security guards. He kept his head down, dragging my struggling, screaming sister across the polished marble floor. Jada's designer heels slipped and skidded against the stone as she fought against his iron grip, her loud protests echoing through the atrium, but Preston overpowered her with sheer terrified adrenaline. They burst through the heavy glass revolving doors, spilling out onto the busy downtown sidewalk and disappearing into the crowds. The silence that fell over the lobby was immediate and profound. The spectacle was over. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the residual tension bleed out of my shoulders. The security chief, Marcus, stepped up beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, as he watched the doors where they had just exited. "Do we need to file a formal trespass report with local law enforcement?" Marcus asked, his tone strictly professional. I shook my head, my eyes lingering on the empty space they had just occupied. "No need, Marcus," I replied calmly. "They will not be coming back to this building, ever." I turned away from the reception desk, ignoring the lingering stares of my colleagues and the visiting executives who had witnessed the entire implosion. I walked back to the private elevator banks, swiped my security badge, and stepped into the stainless steel car. As the doors slid shut, sealing me away from the whispering lobby, a cold, focused energy settled deep into my bones. The time for reactive defense was over. Preston knew I had the data, which meant the countdown to his inevitable flight had officially begun. He would try to liquidate whatever remaining assets he had and vanish, leaving Vivian, Reginald, and Jada to face the catastrophic financial fallout alone. I could not let that happen. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 40th floor. I stepped out and walked briskly down the hushed corridor toward conference room 4. Kendra was still inside, pacing the length of the smartboard, her legal pad covered in frantic shorthand notes. She looked up as I pushed open the heavy glass door, immediately sensing the shift in my demeanor. "Did you handle the distraction?" Kendra asked, her eyes narrowing as she took in my rigid posture. I walked directly to my laptop and pulled the terminal window back into the center of the dual monitors. The red numbers of Preston's failing Cayman accounts glowed brightly. "The distraction is gone," I stated, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I initiated the final decryption sequences. "He knows we have the ledger. He knows the timeline is accelerated." Kendra dropped her pen, moving to stand right beside me. "So what is our next move?" I pulled up the direct reporting portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission, bypassing the anonymous tip line and logging directly into the Priority Federal Fraud Division using my certified forensic credentials. I was no longer just the bitter sister-in-law they could silence with threats of disownment. I was the architect of their impending reality. "We finalized the counterstrike," I said, attaching the redacted wire transfers to the federal evidence file. "We lock the doors, we seal the accounts, and we let the federal government handle the rest." The adrenaline from submitting the federal fraud report to the Securities and Exchange Commission carried me all the way down to the underground parking garage. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the quiet hum of the engine, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just orchestrated in Conference Room 4. Kendra had stayed behind to double-check the encrypted file transfers, ensuring that every single digital footprint of Preston's Cayman Islands gambling debts was securely locked into the federal database. The drive back to the Buckhead district was a blur of neon city lights and evening traffic. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt incredibly light. The burden of carrying my family's toxic secrets was gone, replaced by the cold, surgical precision of justice. I swiped my key fob at the private entrance of my luxury building, nodding to the concierge, before stepping into the private elevator that opened directly onto my floor. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the corridor, reaching into my leather tote bag for my keys. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mother was pacing furiously in front of my custom mahogany front door. Vivian was fully dressed in her country club finest, wearing a crisp linen blazer and clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. The moment she heard the elevator doors, she spun around, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. There was no greeting. There was no motherly concern for the fact that my sister had just caused a massive, humiliating security incident at my place of employment. There was only raw, defensive aggression. She marched right up to me, invading my personal space. Her voice a sharp, hissing whisper designed to echo down the pristine hallway without alerting my affluent neighbors. She demanded to know what I had done to Preston. She claimed he had called her in a complete panic, ranting about me ambushing him in the lobby and threatening him with fabricated financial documents. Vivian did not even wait for my response. She launched into a frantic, delusional monologue about the Sterling family legacy. She pointed her finger in my face, her acrylic nail hovering inches from my eye. She screamed that Preston was an aristocrat, a man born into untouchable New England money, and that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy my sister's one chance at true happiness. I stood perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me. It was genuinely terrifying to witness the absolute hold this con artist had over her. Vivian ranted about generational wealth. She bragged about the elite social circles they were about to enter, completely blind to the fact that her entire reality was built on a crater of fraudulent debt. She actually told me that Jada was securing a bloodline that would elevate our family name forever. She insisted that Preston's elite connections would guarantee their retirement, conveniently ignoring the fact that Preston had already drained every single cent of their actual retirement to pay off his illicit offshore gambling losses. She defended him with a ferocious, blind loyalty that she had never, not once in my entire 32 years of life, extended to me. I was her flesh and blood, a woman who had built a lucrative, legitimate career from the ground up entirely on my own merit. I owned my own home. I paid my own bills. I had never asked her or Reginald for a single dime. Yet, in her eyes, I was entirely disposable. Preston was white, he wore a custom suit, and he spun glorious fairy tales about country clubs and yacht memberships. To Vivian, those superficial markers made him a god, and my refusal to worship at his altar was an unforgivable sin. When she realized I was not reacting to her insults, her frustration boiled over into something much darker. She squared her shoulders, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Since you refuse to respect your family," she sneered, her voice dropping into a lethal, calculated register, "I will make sure you respect the consequences." She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the threat carried a heavy, terrifying weight. She told me that if I did anything else to jeopardize this wedding, if I ever spoke to Preston again, or if I dared to show my face at any of the upcoming bridal events, she would completely destroy me. She threatened to call the senior partners at my forensic accounting firm. She promised to invent a story so vile, so completely damaging to my professional integrity, that I would be fired immediately and blacklisted from the entire financial sector. She claimed she would tell them I was mentally unstable, that I had been stealing from family accounts, and that I was using my corporate position to illegally stalk and harass her wealthy future son-in-law. She was entirely serious. My mother was willing to completely obliterate my livelihood, my hard-earned reputation, and my entire future just to protect a charlatan. She looked me dead in the eyes, her expression devoid of any maternal warmth, and delivered her final verdict. "As far as I am concerned," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "you are no longer my daughter. You are dead to me." The silence in the hallway was deafening. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, processing the profound, staggering betrayal of her words. She was actively offering me up as a human sacrifice on the altar of her own vanity. She was willing to completely destroy her own child just to maintain a fragile, pathetic illusion of high society inclusion. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of daughterly guilt that used to suffocate me whenever I failed to meet her impossible standards. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, liberating clarity. I did not argue with her. I did not try to convince her that she was weeks away from a brutal bank foreclosure. I did not even mention the federal investigation that was already churning toward her precious future son-in-law. The truth would hit her soon enough, and when it did, it would completely decimate the false reality she valued more than my life. I just looked at her, truly seeing the sad, hollow reality of who she was. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I stepped past her, sliding my key into the lock of my heavy mahogany door and pushing it open. I looked back over my shoulder, meeting her furious, confused glare one last time. "I hope you have an absolutely beautiful wedding, Vivian," I said softly. Then I stepped inside my sanctuary and closed the heavy door right in her face, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. The heavy silence of my condo wrapped around me, immediately neutralizing the toxic energy Vivian had left behind. I did not lean against the door and cry. I did not second-guess my actions. I simply walked over to the smart home panel, turned up the ambient temperature to a comfortable 72 degrees, and instructed the system to play a low, rhythmic jazz playlist. The Sterling family drama was officially locked outside. If my mother wanted to declare me dead to protect a man who was actively robbing her blind, I was more than happy to play the ghost. I walked into my master bedroom and headed straight for the walk-in closet. I pulled my matching set of graphite designer luggage down from the top shelf. The smooth, metallic glide of the zippers felt incredibly satisfying. Vivian wanted me banished from the wedding festivities. She wanted me completely removed from the country club illusion she was so desperately clinging to. I was going to grant her wish, but I was going to do it on my own exorbitant terms. I grabbed my laptop, carried it to the kitchen island, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon. I opened my private travel concierge portal. I was not going to sit in this condo and wait for the inevitable fallout. I was going to enjoy my peace. I booked a first-class direct flight to Los Angeles International Airport, scheduled to leave on Thursday morning, perfectly aligning with the start of Jada's extravagant wedding weekend. Next, I bypassed the standard hotel booking sites and logged into an exclusive luxury rental network. I found exactly what I was looking for on Carbon Beach in Malibu. It was a stunning multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls right on the ocean, a private infinity pool, and a wraparound deck. The nightly rate was astronomical, a number that would have sent Reginald into a cold sweat, but I booked it for 4 nights and paid the entire balance in full without blinking. While they were busy performing for a room full of fake friends in rented tuxedos, desperately pretending they were not broke, I would be watching the Pacific tide roll in from a private balcony drinking vintage champagne. With my escape plans solidified, I carried my laptop into my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of my dual monitors. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go to work. I am a forensic accountant, and Vivian had just threatened my professional reputation. It was time to show her exactly why making an enemy out of a woman who understands the intricate flow of hidden capital is the most dangerous mistake a person can make. I opened the heavily encrypted drives I had copied from Preston's server earlier that week. The sheer volume of his financial crimes was staggering. He had not just skimmed off the top. He had executed a systematic predatory dismantling of my parents' entire net worth. I began to compile a master dossier. I did not just throw documents together. I built a lethal, meticulously organized narrative of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. I created side-by-side comparative analyses. On the left side of the screen, I placed the forged signatures Preston had used to authorize the catastrophic home equity loan against my parents' estate. On the right, I placed genuine verified signatures pulled from decades of public property records. The discrepancies were glaring, amateurish, and highly illegal. Then I moved to the main event. I mapped the exact timeline of the stolen capital. I pulled the bank statements showing Reginald's retirement funds being liquidated in massive irregular chunks. I cross-referenced those exact dates and timestamps with the offshore routing numbers associated with the Cayman Islands shell company. I traced the money completely through the digital labyrinth Preston had built, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the funds were never invested in any legitimate portfolio. The money went directly into international clearinghouses known for settling massive unregulated gambling debts. I spent 4 uninterrupted hours organizing the evidence. I created an index color-coded the federal violations and attached the corresponding banking codes to every single fraudulent transaction. The dossier was a masterpiece of financial prosecution. It was so airtight, so overwhelmingly conclusive, that a first-year law student could have used it to secure a conviction. Preston Sterling was not just a liar. He was a federal criminal, and I held the undeniable proof of his impending incarceration. I saved the final master file, exporting it into a heavily encrypted PDF. I opened 2 separate, highly secure communication portals. The first was the official whistleblower intake portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second was a direct encrypted email channel to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, a contact I had established during a previous corporate audit. I attached the digital dossier to both messages. I did not include any emotional pleas or personal family history. I simply stated my credentials, outlined the exact statutes violated, and provided the routing numbers for the stolen funds. I moved my cursor over the send button. There was no hesitation. I clicked down, launching the digital missiles into the federal network. The data was officially out of my hands. The federal gears would begin turning long before Vivian even put on her mother of the bride dress. But sending digital files to federal agencies was a sterile bureaucratic process. It lacked the personal touch this particular betrayal required. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a stack of heavy premium cardstock. I loaded it into my high-capacity laser printer. I selected the print command for the entire unredacted dossier. The machine hummed to life, methodically spitting out page after page of Preston's financial crimes, the forged signatures, the Cayman routing numbers, and the zeroed-out balances of my parents' accounts. The paper felt thick and substantial in my hands as I gathered the freshly printed pages. I aligned the edges perfectly, tapping them against the mahogany desk. I opened a sleek black leather presentation portfolio and placed the physical document securely inside. I ran my hand over the smooth leather cover. The federal agents had their digital copies, and they would do their jobs in due time. But this physical copy, this undeniable manifestation of the truth, was not meant for a courtroom or a federal investigator. I placed the leather portfolio carefully into my designer tote bag. This copy was meant for a very special delivery. I stared at the black leather portfolio resting on my mahogany desk. The digital files were already echoing through the encrypted servers of federal law enforcement, but digital files were invisible. They lacked the visceral physical weight required to shatter a delusion as deeply entrenched as Vivian's. I needed a delivery mechanism that matched the grotesque extravagance of the event they were hosting. I walked into my dressing room and opened the top drawer of my accessory island. Inside sat an immaculate matte white gift box from a high-end boutique originally intended for a piece of custom jewelry I had purchased for a client. It was constructed of heavy premium cardstock exuding a quiet, expensive elegance. I carried it back to my office and set it on the desk next to the portfolio. I opened the box and smoothed out the black velvet lining inside. It was incredibly soft, a luxurious bed for the absolute destruction of the Sterling family legacy. I opened the leather portfolio and extracted the freshly printed documents. I did not just shove them inside, I curated them. I placed the Cayman Islands offshore routing transcripts at the very bottom, establishing the foundation of Preston's fraud. On top of that, I laid the zeroed-out balance sheets of Reginald's once robust retirement accounts. 30 years of my father's corporate loyalty. 30 years of early mornings and late nights, completely erased by a smooth-talking con artist in less than 6 months. Then came the centerpiece. I placed the official bank foreclosure notices directly on top. The bold, undeniable red ink of the default status starkly contrasted with the crisp white paper. This was the document that would hurt Vivian the most. It was the legal confirmation that her pristine suburban estate, the literal cornerstone of her precious high society illusion, no longer belonged to her. The bank owned it, and the eviction countdown had already begun. I placed the lid on the box, sealing the radioactive truth inside. To complete the illusion, I retrieved a spool of pristine ivory silk ribbon from my wrapping supplies. I measured it carefully, wrapping it around the matte white box, crossing it underneath and pulling it tight. I tied a flawless, elaborate bow right on top. I adjusted the loops until they were perfectly symmetrical. It looked exactly like a generous, high-end wedding gift from a wealthy relative. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the exact physical manifestation of my family's obsession with outward appearances masking internal rot. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, painting my condo in shades of pale gold and pink, my luggage was packed and waiting by the front door. I made myself an espresso and opened my laptop to contact a specialized elite courier service. I bypassed the standard delivery companies. I needed absolute guaranteed precision, and I was willing to pay heavily for it. I selected a firm that catered exclusively to high-net-worth clients specializing in secure targeted deliveries of sensitive corporate assets. Within 45 minutes, a professional courier arrived at my door. He wore a sharp black suit, a subtle earpiece, and projected an aura of absolute discretion. I handed him the white silk-tied box, along with a sealed envelope containing his instructions and a massive cash retainer. I did not leave anything to chance. My directives were explicit and non-negotiable. I instructed him to hold the package in a secure climate-controlled vault until Saturday evening. At exactly 8:30 at night, when the wedding reception at the Piedmont Country Club was reaching its peak, when the champagne was flowing and the toasts were beginning, he was to walk directly into the main ballroom. He was instructed to bypass the gift table entirely. He was to approach the head table asked specifically for Vivian Sterling, the mother of the bride, and hand the box directly into her hands. He was to wait just long enough to ensure she untied the ribbon, and then he was to leave the premises immediately without answering a single question. The courier read over the instructions, his expression completely blank. He gave me a single professional nod of confirmation, tucked the white box under his arm, and stepped back into the elevator. The weapon was officially in transit. I locked the door to my condo and called a private black car service to take me to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The morning traffic was dense, a sprawling sea of commuters rushing to their miserable corporate jobs, completely unaware of the silent detonations occurring in the city around them. I leaned back against the plush leather seat of the town car, watching the familiar streets blur past my tinted window. I felt absolutely no remorse. Vivian had threatened to destroy my professional reputation and obliterate my livelihood just to protect a criminal. Jada had screamed in my face in the middle of my corporate lobby and demanded I surrender vintage family property that belonged to me. Preston had arrogantly assumed I was too stupid to see through his manufactured aristocratic facade. They had all dug their own graves with their vanity and their greed. I was simply providing the headstones. The airport was a chaotic mess of frantic travelers, but I moved through it completely insulated by the privileges of first-class travel. I bypassed the winding security lines, breezed through the priority screening lane, and walked directly to the exclusive airline lounge. I sat in a quiet corner, sipping sparkling water and watching the departure boards roll through their endless international destinations. For the first time in my adult life, I was not traveling for a grueling forensic audit or a high-stakes corporate merger. I was traveling exclusively for myself. When my flight to Los Angeles was called, I boarded the aircraft and found my oversized lie-flat seat in the first-class cabin. I stowed my designer tote bag, settled into the soft leather, and let out a long, slow breath. The physical weight of the past few months seemed to lift off my shoulders, dissolving into the recycled cabin air. The flight attendant, a warm woman with a bright smile, stopped by my aisle to offer a pre-flight beverage. I did not hesitate. I asked for a mimosa. She returned a moment later with a crystal flute filled with chilled champagne and a splash of fresh orange juice. I took the glass, thanking her softly. I turned my head to look out the small oval window. The massive jet engines roared to life, pushing us back from the gate and taxiing toward the runway. As the plane accelerated, pressing me back into my seat with a powerful surge of momentum, I took a slow, deliberate sip of the mimosa. The cold, crisp bubbles danced on my tongue. The wheels lifted off the tarmac, and the sprawling green canopy of Atlanta began to shrink beneath us. I looked down at the city where my family was currently running around in a frantic, oblivious frenzy, obsessing over floral arrangements, seating charts, and designer dresses. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already completely crumbled. I took another sip of my drink, reclining my seat as we climbed above the clouds, knowing with absolute certainty that a catastrophic storm was about to hit Atlanta, and I was going to watch the lightning strike from a private balcony in Malibu. The morning sun filtering through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Carbon Beach rental woke me. I did not jolt upright in a panic. I simply opened my eyes and watched the Pacific Ocean rhythmically crash against the pristine shoreline. The air smelled of salt and expensive cedarwood from the house's custom diffusers. I stepped out of the massive California king bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush white wool rug. I walked out onto the private wrap-around deck. The breeze was cool, a sharp, refreshing contrast to the humid, suffocating tension I had left behind in Georgia. Inside the sleek, open-concept kitchen, my hired private chef, a quiet culinary artist named Matteo, was already at work. The rich, dark aroma of freshly ground espresso beans filled the space. He handed me a delicate porcelain cup without a single word, perfectly anticipating my morning routine. I took a sip, the bitter, complex flavor grounding me in the present moment. I sat on a low-slung designer sofa facing the ocean, crossing my legs and letting the absolute tranquility of the multi-million-dollar estate wash over me. There were no frantic wedding planners. There were no screaming mothers demanding compliance. There was only the sound of the ocean and the profound satisfaction of knowing I held all the cards. My phone, resting on the glass coffee table, vibrated softly. The screen lit up with a secure message notification. It was Kendra. As a senior associate at my firm, She had easily secured an invitation to the sterling wedding of the century under the guise of corporate representation. I had explicitly instructed her not to intervene, just to observe and report. I unlocked the screen, swiping open the chat thread. The disparity between my serene Saturday morning and the absolute disaster unfolding in Atlanta was deliciously sharp. Vivian is currently terrorizing a florist in the main foyer, Kendra wrote. She is threatening to withhold payment because the imported white orchids have a slight yellow undertone that clashes with the ivory silk napkins. She is screaming about the sterling legacy and demanding absolute perfection. I took another sip of my espresso, visualizing the chaotic scene. Vivian was desperately trying to micromanage every single visual aspect of the wedding. She needed the illusion of generational wealth to be flawless, completely unaware that the very foundation of her country club fantasy had already been bulldozed. Her tyrannical behavior toward the service staff was not a sign of power. It was a glaring symptom of her deep-seated frantic insecurity. She was bankrupting herself to impress people who would not even remember her name by next week. She was so obsessed with the performance of wealth that she completely ignored the mechanics of it. My phone buzzed again. Kendra was sending real-time updates from the pre-ceremony cocktail hour. "You need to see the groom," the next text read. "He looks like he is marching to his own execution. He is sweating through a bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket. He has not spoken to a single guest. He is standing by the ice sculpture, obsessively checking his phone every 30 seconds and staring at the entrance like he expects a federal SWAT team to burst through the doors." A genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet luxury of the Malibu rental. Preston was suffocating in his own trap. He knew I had the forensic evidence. He knew I had the power to dismantle his entire life, but he had absolutely no idea when or where the blow would land. The psychological torture of waiting for the axe to fall was tearing him apart from the inside out. He could not enjoy the lavish celebration he had conned my parents into funding. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his impending exposure. He was trapped in a room full of high society elites, wearing a stolen crown that was rapidly melting down his face. Every time the heavy mahogany doors of the country club opened, his heart undoubtedly hammered against his ribs. The day stretched out in a luxurious, unhurried pace. I spent the afternoon walking barefoot along the private beach, the cold water washing over my ankles. I read a book on the deck. I ate a flawless multi-course seafood lunch prepared by Mateo. I did not check my emails. I did not think about my mother's toxic final words to me in that condo hallway. I actively chose to exist in a state of absolute, unbothered peace. I was completely detached from the emotional carnage I was about to inflict, treating the entire operation with the cold, clinical detachment of a corporate audit. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the California sky in violent streaks of magenta and bruised purple, the timeline in Atlanta shifted into the critical zone. It was nearing 8:30 on the East Coast. The grand performative ceremony was over. Jada had undoubtedly walked down the aisle radiating smug triumph, firmly believing she had secured her status as a wealthy socialite. Vivian had undoubtedly wept perfect photogenic tears for the cameras, playing the role of the proud aristocratic matriarch to absolute perfection. Now the main event was beginning. I walked back into the living room and sat down on the sofa, the glow of the twilight reflecting off the glass walls. I picked up my phone and opened the specialized tracking application provided by the Elite Courier Service. A highly detailed encrypted map of the Piedmont Country Club filled my screen. Kendra sent another rapid-fire text. "The reception doors are open. Hundreds of people are taking their seats. The crystal chandeliers are blinding. Waiters are pouring vintage champagne for the opening toasts. Vivian is practically vibrating with smug satisfaction at the head table. She thinks she won. She thinks she actually pulled this off." I did not reply to Kendra. My eyes were completely locked onto the blinking blue dot on the tracking map. The dot moved steadily along the winding tree-lined driveway of the exclusive country club. It bypassed the valet staging area. It glided smoothly past the outer security gates. The courier was precise, moving with the exact, undetected efficiency I had paid a premium for. He was a ghost slipping into a fortress of manufactured vanity. I watched the digital marker stop right at the coordinates of the main ballroom entrance. The app refreshed. A stark green notification banner dropped down from the top of my screen. Courier has entered the building. Target acquired. Commencing delivery. The digital notification hovered on my screen for exactly 2 seconds before my phone vibrated with an incoming FaceTime call. It was Kendra. I answered immediately, hitting the mute button on my end, so the rhythmic crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean would not betray my sanctuary. The video feed stabilized, offering a crystal-clear, high-definition broadcast from the absolute epicenter of the Piedmont Country Club ballroom. Kendra had strategically positioned her phone against a massive crystal centerpiece at a premium table, giving me a flawless, unobstructed view of the main event. I leaned back into the plush cushions of my Malibu sofa. Matteo, my private chef, handed me a small plate of artisan biscotti without making a sound. I took a bite, savoring the subtle notes of almond and citrus, while watching the chaotic, suffocating opulence of my mother's financial ruin play out on a 6-inch screen. The contrast was genuinely cinematic. I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece, bathed in cool ocean breezes and absolute silence, while my family was trapped in a grotesque high-stress display of forced wealth. Vivian had completely lost her mind. The ballroom was a chaotic explosion of extravagance. Towering pillars of white orchids dominated every single table, reaching toward the vaulted ceilings. Gold-rimmed champagne flutes sparkled under the blinding light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. It was a spectacular, desperate performance of generational wealth funded entirely by a criminal who had already drained their accounts to zero. There they were. Jada sat at the sweetheart table looking like a frosted cupcake in her heavily beaded custom gown, practically vibrating with narcissistic energy. Vivian sat to her right, wearing a terrifyingly smug expression, playing the role of the aristocratic matriarch to an audience of complete strangers. Reginald looked exhausted, nursing a glass of scotch, entirely oblivious to the fact that his life savings were currently bouncing between unregulated offshore clearinghouses. And then there was Preston. He was a man actively decomposing in real time. The bespoke midnight blue velvet tuxedo he wore was visibly suffocating him. He was glistening with a cold, frantic sweat, constantly swiping a monogrammed linen handkerchief across his forehead. He was not looking at his new bride. He was not smiling at the guests. He was scanning the room, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors every few seconds. He knew I was missing. He knew I had the server drives. The psychological torture of waiting for the axe to fall was tearing his nervous system to shreds. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his impending exposure, trapped in a room full of high society elites while wearing a stolen crown that was rapidly melting down his face. Suddenly, the heavy ballroom doors swung open. The courier stepped inside. He was a phantom of absolute cold professionalism in a sea of drunken celebrating guests. He wore a razor-sharp black suit, moving with a purposeful, unhurried stride that immediately commanded the room's subconscious attention. He bypassed the designated gift table overflowing with silver-wrapped boxes. He ignored the waitstaff. He walked straight down the center aisle directly toward the sweetheart table. In his gloved hands, he carried the heavy velvet-lined presentation box. I had chosen a deep, matte black velvet exterior for the portfolio, tied tightly with a pristine, thick white silk ribbon. It looked incredibly expensive, heavy, and significant. It looked exactly like the kind of extravagant peace offering a wealthy, defeated family member would send to beg for forgiveness. The courier stopped directly in front of Jada and Preston. The low murmur of the ballroom began to quiet down as guests noticed the formal interruption. The courier did not speak a single word. He simply bowed his head a fraction of an inch, placed the heavy velvet box perfectly in the center of the table, right between Jada's dinner plate and Preston's untouched champagne flute, and turned on his heel. He marched right back down the aisle and disappeared through the mahogany doors. Jada stared at the box. An envelope was tucked under the silk ribbon, bearing my name in crisp, embossed gold lettering. Recognition flashed across Jada's face, followed instantly by a wave of unadulterated, triumphant arrogance. She actually thought I had broken. She genuinely believed that Vivian's threats and the sheer weight of the Sterling family delusion had forced me into submission. She looked at Vivian, who offered a slow, validating nod. The best man was standing up, tapping his glass with a spoon to begin his toast, but Jada completely intercepted him. She stood up her gown, catching the chandelier light, and aggressively snatched the microphone from its stand on the main floor. A sharp screech of feedback echoed through the room, instantly silencing the remaining chatter. Hundreds of faces turned toward the bride. Jada cleared her throat, adopting a tone of sickly sweet manufactured grace. "Excuse me, everyone," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Before we begin the toasts, I need to share a very special moment with all of you." She paused, letting the silence stretch, maximizing the theatricality of her performance. She turned her body slightly so Preston's snooty imported relatives could see her perfectly. She wanted to show them she had conquered her unruly sibling. She wanted the aesthetic of the magnanimous victor. As many of you know, family is the most important thing in the world to the Sterlings. We believe in legacy. We believe in unity. She looked down at the velvet box, tracing her manicured fingers over the pristine white silk ribbon. "My older sister could not be here tonight. She has been struggling with some personal issues. She has been dealing with a lot of jealousy, a lot of bitterness regarding my happiness and the incredible man I married today." A low murmur of sympathetic gossip rippled through the audience. Vivian was practically glowing with pride at her daughter's public assassination of my character. "But love conquers all," Jada continued, her voice dripping with fake emotion. "She just sent this via private courier. It is a peace offering. She has finally realized that she cannot fight family. She has capitulated, apologized, and sent her blessing." Jada looked out at the sea of guests bathing in their attentive adoration. She was completely intoxicated by her own delusional narrative. She assumed the heavy box contained Big Mama's vintage diamond ring, the priceless family heirloom she had screamed at me for in the corporate lobby, or a massive six-figure check to fund her fraudulent lifestyle. Jada turned to the professional videography team hovering near the edge of the dance floor. "Get over here," she commanded, waving them forward. "I want this on film. I want the exact moment our family healed recorded forever." The lead videographer rushed forward, hoisting a massive camera onto his shoulder. He flipped on a blindingly bright LED spotlight that illuminated the velvet box like a museum exhibit. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the grand reveal. Beside her, Preston finally looked down at the box. The gold-embossed envelope with my name on it caught the bright video light. His face went from pale to a sickening shade of translucent gray. The forensic auditor, the missing sister, the encrypted servers, the high-end corporate courier delivering documents directly to the head table. The horrific reality of the situation slammed into his brain with the force of a freight train. This was not a gift, it was a public execution. "Let us see what my sister sent to apologize," Jada purred into the microphone, reaching for the pristine silk ribbon. "Jada, no," Preston choked out. It was a frantic, breathless whisper, but the microphone in Jada's hand picked it up, amplifying his raw terror across the massive ballroom speakers. He lunged out of his chair. He reached across the table, his hand clawing desperately to grab her wrist, to cover the box, to stop the impending explosion. He knocked over his crystal water glass, the liquid shattering across the pristine white tablecloth. He was a desperate animal caught in a trap, abandoning all aristocratic pretense in a blind panic. But he was a fraction of a second too late. Jada yanked the silk ribbon. It unraveled with a smooth, frictionless slide. She flipped the velvet lid open, directly facing the blinding light of the camera lens, exposing the absolute destruction waiting inside. Through the pristine, high-definition display of my phone, framed perfectly by the gentle sway of Malibu palm trees and the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean, I watched my sister destroy her own life. The videographer had positioned his blinding LED spotlight directly on the sweetheart table, washing out the ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers. Jada was completely illuminated, practically glowing with toxic arrogance. She gripped the microphone tightly in her left hand, her knuckles white, while her right hand pinched the end of the ivory silk ribbon. With a sharp, theatrical tug, Jada unraveled the bow. She smiled widely at Preston's elite imported relatives seated in the front row, desperate to prove that she had successfully brought her rebellious, jealous sister to heel. She flipped the heavy lid of the matte white box open and tossed it carelessly onto the table. She reached inside her face, arranged in an expression of exaggerated, magnanimous acceptance, fully expecting to pull out a velvet jewelry pouch or a certified cashier's check with enough zeros to fund her fraudulent lifestyle for another year. Instead, her fingers closed around a thick, heavy stack of industrial paper. Her triumphant smile froze, fracturing at the edges. She pulled the massive stack of documents out of the box. There was no jewelry. There was no apology note. There was only the cold, hard manifestation of a federal financial crime. The top document was printed on official bank letterhead. Stamped across the top right corner in aggressive, undeniable red ink was a legal seal. Jada stared at it, her perfectly contoured brow furrowing in deep confusion. She lacked the financial literacy to immediately understand the gravity of what she was holding, but the aggressive red lettering clearly unnerved her. The entire ballroom was dead silent, waiting for the grand reveal. The only sound in the massive space was the low hum of the microphone in Jada's hand. She looked down at the paper, completely bewildered, and made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. She began to read the document out loud, her voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and echoing into every corner of the room. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Jada read, her voice dripping with confusion, the words amplifying with crystal clarity over the speakers. She squinted at the text, holding the paper closer to her face. Property address. She recited the exact street address of Vivian and Reginald's pristine suburban estate. A low, collective murmur rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. The clinking of silverware completely stopped. Jada did not stop reading. The momentum of the moment carried her forward, her brain failing to process the catastrophic nature of the words leaving her mouth. Primary account holder Reginald Sterling. Status default. Current portfolio balance $0.00. Total unrecoverable loss. Account liquidated. She flipped to the second page, her voice trembling now, the manufactured sweetness completely gone. Offshore routing transfer authorized by Preston Sterling. Destination Cayman Islands Holdings. The words foreclosure and account liquidated hung in the air, echoing violently against the silent, horrified shock of the crowd. The elite socialites Vivian had so desperately tried to impress were now staring at the head table with open mouths and wide, scandalized eyes. The illusion of generational wealth evaporated in less than 30 seconds, replaced by the ugly, undeniable stench of absolute ruin. Sitting on my deck in Malibu 3,000 miles away, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The ocean breeze was cool against my skin. The execution was flawless. On the screen, the camera panned violently to the right, capturing Vivian. My mother was completely frozen, her face drained of all color, taking on the waxy, translucent hue of a corpse. The reality of the documents slammed into her chest with the force of a physical blow. The pristine estate, the country club memberships, the retirement funds she had bragged about for decades, all of it was gone. It was not just a temporary cash flow problem, it was total, irreversible annihilation. A guttural, horrifying shriek tore from Vivian's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, the sound of a woman watching her entire identity burn to the ground. Her hand spasmed, and the crystal champagne flute she had been holding slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished hardwood of the dance floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the sharp crash cutting through the stunned silence of the room like a gunshot. The shattered glass seemed to break the spell holding the room hostage. Absolute chaos erupted. Guests began murmuring loudly, pointing at the head table. Preston's wealthy relatives were whispering furiously to one another, their faces twisted in disgust. Preston was no longer sweating, he was hyperventilating. His aristocratic facade was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, bug-eyed terror of a cornered rat. He realized exactly what was happening. He knew I had not just sent those documents to a wedding reception. If I had the forensic evidence mapped out so perfectly on paper, he knew exactly who else had received it. He knew the federal authorities were already mobilizing. "Give me those!" Preston snarled, his voice a panicked, breathless rasp that the microphone picked up and broadcast to the entire room. He lunged across the sweetheart table, knocking over the massive floral centerpiece. The towering arrangement of white orchids crashed onto the floor, sending water and crushed petals everywhere. He reached for the thick stack of papers in Jada's hands, his fingers clawing desperately to rip the evidence away from her. Jada shrieked, stumbling backward in her heavy beaded gown, trying to pull the documents out of his reach. The groom was actively attacking the bride in front of 300 horrified witnesses. I watched the screen intently, leaning forward on my sofa. The timing was aligning with mathematical perfection. Before Preston could snatch the foreclosure notices from Jada's hands, a massive booming sound echoed from the back of the room. The heavy, ornate mahogany doors of the Piedmont Country Club ballroom burst open with enough force to slam against the interior walls. The sudden noise caused the videographer to whip his camera around, capturing the entrance in stark, high-definition focus. Through the open doorway, the dark, humid Atlanta night was violently illuminated. Brilliant strobing flashes of blue and red police lights pulsed frantically against the venue's towering stained glass windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the horrified faces of the wedding guests. The wail of approaching sirens grew deafeningly loud, cutting through the murmurs and shouts of the ballroom. Federal agents and heavily armed local police officers began pouring through the entrance, their tactical gear a jarring, terrifying contrast to the silk gowns and rented tuxedos filling the room. They moved with aggressive, calculated speed, fanning out across the reception space and advancing directly down the center aisle. I sat back against the cushions in Malibu, the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean providing a soothing soundtrack to the ultimate destruction of Preston Sterling. I took another bite of my biscotti, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the camera lens. The storm had officially made landfall. The chaotic symphony of the Piedmont Country Club ballroom shattered the moment the federal agents crossed the threshold. A dozen men and women wearing dark, tactical windbreakers with stark yellow FBI lettering emblazoned across their backs swarmed the reception, fanning out with practiced military precision. The heavy rhythmic thumping of their boots against the polished marble floor completely drowned out the horrified gasps of the wedding guests. The 12-piece live band, which had been playing a soft classical prelude for the toasts, ground to a sudden, agonizing halt. A cellist dragged his bow harshly across the strings, producing a final discordant screech that hung in the humid Atlanta air. Through the glowing screen of my phone, I watched the lead agent march straight down the center aisle. He held up a gold badge, his voice booming with absolute authority, ordering the room to remain exactly where they were. Nobody moved. The elite socialites, the local politicians, the wealthy business moguls that Vivian had so desperately gathered to witness her family's ascension were entirely frozen, trapped in a horrifying tableau of high society disgrace. At the head table, Preston did not try to comfort his new bride. He did not look at Vivian, who was still hyperventilating over the foreclosure documents scattered across the white linen. His survival instinct, entirely devoid of loyalty or grace, kicked in with violent speed. He locked eyes with the swinging silver doors of the catering kitchen on the far side of the ballroom. It was the only exit not currently blocked by federal authorities. Preston bolted. He scrambled out of his chair so fast he knocked the heavy wooden seat backward into a hovering waiter. He did not care. He lowered his head and sprinted toward the kitchen, his bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket restricting his frantic movements. The sheer cowardice of the groom abandoning his bride at their own wedding reception was staggering. He shoved violently through the crowd of stunned guests, throwing his shoulders into anyone who stood in his path. He pushed a bridesmaid aside, sending her tumbling into a table of elderly relatives. He knocked a tray of champagne out of a server's hands, the glass shattering and the expensive wine pooling across the dance floor. He was 10 feet away from the kitchen doors. He was panting heavily, his face slick with a terrified sweat, his eyes fixed on the exit. He actually thought he was going to make it. He genuinely believed he could outrun a federal indictment in velvet loafers. He was wrong. A tactical agent had already flanked the perimeter, slipping through the service corridor. Just as Preston reached his hand out to push through the swinging silver doors, the agent stepped squarely into his path. Preston tried to pivot his leather shoes, slipping wildly on the spilled champagne. It was all the agent needed. The agent lunged forward, driving his shoulder directly into Preston's chest. The impact lifted the groom completely off his feet. The trajectory of the tackle sent both men hurtling away from the kitchen doors and directly toward the main focal point of the reception. They crashed violently into the custom 5-tier wedding cake. The destruction was absolute and spectacular. The massive structure of white chocolate ganache, imported raspberry buttercream, and delicate edible gold leaf exploded on impact. Preston hit the floor with a heavy, breathless thud, completely buried beneath 50 pounds of ruined pastry and shattered sugar glass. The top tier of the cake rolled across the polished floor, leaving a thick, humiliating trail of pink frosting in its wake. Preston gasped for air, thrashing wildly amidst the ruined cake, his expensive tuxedo coated in thick layers of white fondant. The agent did not hesitate. He flipped Preston roughly onto his stomach, pinning the groom's face directly into a crushed layer of sponge cake. He grabbed Preston's wrists, wrenching his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed loudly in the silent ballroom. It was the definitive sound of a life ending. The lead agent marched over to the wreckage, looking down at the groom with an expression of absolute disgust. Jada's hired videographer, still operating under her earlier command to film everything, had his camera focused tightly on the scene, broadcasting the humiliation to the massive screens positioned around the room. The lead agent did not lower his voice. He wanted the entire room to hear the charges. He wanted the high society crowd to know exactly who they had been drinking with. "Preston Sterling," the agent announced, his voice ringing with cold legal finality. "You are under arrest for multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Preston sobbed into the floor, his face smeared with frosting and tears. He was completely broken, a fraud stripped of his designer armor, exposed as a common thief in front of 300 horrified guests. But the Sterling delusion was a deeply ingrained disease, and it did not die easily. Pushing through the crowd of terrified onlookers came Arthur and Beatrice Sterling. Preston's parents exuded the toxic entitlement of old money arrogance. Beatrice marched forward in a silver Carolina Herrera gown, her face twisted in aristocratic fury, completely ignoring the fact that her son was currently wearing handcuffs and wedding cake. Arthur followed closely behind her, his face purple with indignant rage. They had operated for decades under the assumption that their last name made them untouchable, that laws were merely suggestions for the lower classes. "Get your hands off my son this instant," Arthur roared, pointing a trembling finger at the federal agents. "This is an absolute outrage. Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Sterlings. I play golf with the federal judge of this district. I will have your badges for this public humiliation. Unhand him right now." Beatrice turned to the stunned crowd, desperately trying to manage the optics of a federal raid. "This is clearly a misunderstanding," she announced loudly, forcing a terrible, brittle smile. "A clerical error. Preston is the victim of a corporate witch hunt." The lead agent slowly turned away from the sobbing groom on the floor and locked eyes with Arthur Sterling. The agent did not look intimidated. He looked deeply bored by the performance. He reached inside his windbreaker and pulled out a separate, heavily folded document. "Arthur Sterling," the agent said, his voice dropping to a calm, dangerously quiet tone that somehow carried across the entire room. "We know exactly who you are. We also know exactly where the money went." Arthur's furious expression faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief, terrifying flash of reality broke through his arrogant facade. "We trace the routing numbers from your son's corporate accounts directly into your holding companies." The agent continued, taking a step closer to the older man. "We know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We know about the shell corporations registered in your wife's name. We have the server drives. We have all the financial footprints." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The brittle smile completely vanished. "I strongly suggest you put your phone away, Mr. Sterling, because calling your friends will not help you," the agent stated, his eyes locking onto Arthur with predatory focus. "As of 10 minutes ago, federal warrants were executed on all of your properties. Every single bank account, investment portfolio, and trust fund bearing the Sterling name has been frozen and seized under federal forfeiture laws. You cannot touch a single dime. You are completely broke." The devastating finality of the federal agent's words hung over the ballroom like a physical weight. Arthur Sterling stared at the man, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating shock. The untouchable patriarch of the Sterling Empire was suddenly just an old, broken man in a rented tuxedo, stripped of his power, his capital, and his dignity. Beatrice swayed dangerously on her designer heels, clutching her husband's arm to keep from collapsing onto the frosting-covered floor. At the sweetheart table, the reality of the situation finally penetrated Jada's thick layer of narcissistic delusion. She stood completely frozen amidst the wreckage of her dream wedding. The towering white orchids lay crushed around her. The spilled champagne soaked into the hem of her custom hand-beaded gown. She looked down at the bright red foreclosure stamp on the heavy stack of documents I had sent. She looked at Preston, the man she had married strictly for his phantom wealth, currently being hauled to his feet by 2 federal agents, his face smeared with tears, sweat, and white chocolate ganache. Jada dropped to her knees. She did not fall with grace. She collapsed with the sheer, unadulterated terror of a woman realizing she had just legally chained herself to a federal criminal. A high-pitched, hysterical scream ripped from her throat, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned guests. She clutched the financial documents to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. She tore at the tulle and silk of her dress, suddenly suffocated by the costume of a life she would never actually get to live. Reginald snapped out of his Scotch-induced paralysis. The sound of his favorite daughter screaming on the floor finally propelled him into action. He scrambled around the massive table, his dress shoes slipping on the wet floor, and snatched the documents right out of Jada's trembling hands. Vivian was right behind him, her face a mask of absolute panic. Reginald flipped through the heavy pages, his eyes darting frantically across the columns of numbers, the bank seals, the unyielding legal jargon. I had color-coded the forensic audit perfectly. It was designed so that even a man blinded by his own ego could understand his total financial annihilation in less than 30 seconds. I watched through the camera lens as Reginald's chest began to heave. He traced a trembling finger over the specific offshore routing numbers. The horrific truth washed over him in real time. Preston had not just lied about his own wealth. Preston had used the wedding planning process, the shared vendor accounts, and Reginald's desperate desire to impress the Sterlings to gain backdoor access to my parents' primary investment portfolios. Preston had systematically drained my parents' retirement funds, their savings, and leveraged the equity in their pristine suburban estate to plug the massive bleeding holes in his own fraudulent hedge fund. He had used them as a human shield against his inevitable federal indictment. He took everything. Reginald choked out, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable rasp. He looked up, staring blankly at the chaotic ballroom. "The house, the accounts. It is all gone. We have nothing." Vivian snatched the paper from his hands. She stared at the zero balances. She stared at the bright red notice of default. The aristocratic matriarch persona she had spent decades meticulously crafting shattered into a million pieces. But Vivian did not mourn the betrayal of her new son-in-law. She did not mourn the emotional destruction of her daughter crying on the floor. Vivian immediately looked out at the audience. She saw the elite socialites, the country club board members, the wealthy neighbors she had spent her entire life trying to impress. They were not looking at her with envy anymore. They were looking at her with profound, unapologetic disgust. Several guests already had their phones out, recording the magnificent downfall of the most arrogant family in Atlanta. The manager of the Piedmont Country Club was already marching across the floor, closely followed by the head of the catering company, both of them undoubtedly realizing that the credit cards on file for this lavish event were about to bounce aggressively. The absolute humiliation was too much for Vivian's fragile, ego-driven nervous system to handle. She let out a guttural, hyperventilating wail, clutching her perfectly styled hair. She dropped the foreclosure papers, stumbling backward into a waiter's tray stand, sending a dozen empty plates crashing to the ground. She was completely bankrupt, utterly disgraced, and entirely exposed in front of the entire city. Back in the pristine, silent sanctuary of my Malibu rental, the live video feed abruptly cut out. Kendra had likely been ushered out of the ballroom along with the rest of the non-essential guests as the federal agent secured the crime scene. I set my phone face down on the glass coffee table. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline directly below my private deck. The contrast was magnificent. I was breathing clean, salty air, surrounded by unbothered luxury, while my former family was drowning in the toxic, inescapable wreckage of their own making. Seconds later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the glass tabletop. I did not pick it up immediately. I watched the screen light up with a frantic, unyielding desperation. The caller ID flashed rapidly, cycling through names I had once programmed into my phone with a heavy, obligated heart. Reginald calling. Missed call. Vivian calling. Missed call. Jada calling. Missed call. The notifications began pouring in a digital avalanche of sheer panic. The automated voicemail transcription feature on my phone captured their messages, flashing the desperate text directly onto my lock screen. Reginald, you have to fix this. You know how to track these accounts. You are a forensic auditor. Call the firm. Call your contacts. You have to find where he put the money. I will give you whatever you want. I will make you a full partner. Just answer the phone. I let out a short, quiet laugh. Even in the absolute depths of his self-inflicted ruin, Reginald still believed he had something to offer me. He still thought he could dangle a partnership, a crumb of his approval, to force me into saving him. He completely failed to realize that I had already built my own empire entirely without his permission. The phone vibrated again. The next transcript populated on the screen. Vivian, how could you do this during the reception? Everyone saw. Everyone knows. The club manager just threatened to have us arrested for theft of services. They are taking the house. They are taking my cars. You owe us. We raised you. You have to wire us money right now. Answer your phone. She was entirely unrepentant. She was not apologizing for throwing me out. She was not apologizing for tearing down my career. She was only furious that her public performance had been ruined, and she was demanding my hard-earned capital to rebuild her hollow fantasy. She viewed me exactly as she always had, as an endless disposable resource, meant only to serve her vanity. A third transcription appeared. Jada. My life is over. Preston is in a federal holding cell. They are questioning me. They think I knew about the fraud. They are seizing my wedding gifts. I have nowhere to go. You have to pay for my lawyer. You are my sister. You cannot just abandon me like this. Please. I stared at the glowing text. Jada had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She had gleefully participated in my exile. She had mocked my career, belittled my independence, and proudly paraded her fraudulent relationship as proof of her superiority. Now covered in cake and facing federal questioning, she suddenly remembered we shared DNA. I picked up the phone. The sleek metal felt cool and heavy in my hand. I did not listen to the audio of their sobbing voices. I did not need to hear the manipulative pitch of their desperate pleas. I had spent 30 years internalizing their toxic demands, contorting myself into painful shapes just to earn a fraction of their conditional love. That era was permanently closed. With slow, deliberate movements, I opened my contact list. I selected Reginald's name. I scrolled to the very bottom of his profile. I pressed the bright red text. Block caller. I opened Vivian's profile. Block caller. I opened Jada's profile. Block caller. The digital severance was absolute. The violent vibration of the phone ceased instantly. The frantic notifications vanished. The screen went dark, returning to a peaceful, unbothered black mirror. I had completely isolated them in the radioactive wasteland of their own making. No amount of screaming, begging, or familial guilt-tripping would ever reach me again. They were ghosts haunting a graveyard they had dug with their own hands. I stood up from the designer sofa, my bare feet padding softly across the plush white rug. I walked toward the massive sliding glass doors that opened onto the private balcony. I pushed them aside, stepping out into the brilliant golden warmth of the California afternoon. The sun was hanging low over the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of coral and gold. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretched out infinitely before me, wild, powerful, and completely free. I leaned against the smooth glass railing, feeling the gentle sea breeze lift the hair off my shoulders. I raised my right hand, holding it up to the golden light. Big Mama's vintage emerald-cut diamond ring caught the sunlight, throwing brilliant kaleidoscopic prisms across the wooden deck. She had bypassed Vivian. She had bypassed Jada. She had secretly entrusted the true, enduring legacy of the Sterling family to me, recognizing the quiet resilience that the rest of them so deeply despised. She knew that wealth was not about performative luxury or country club status. It was about independence, integrity, and the strength to stand entirely on your own. I was the scapegoat who had refused to be sacrificed. I had absorbed their cruelty, weaponized my own silence, and meticulously engineered my absolute freedom. I was financially secure, professionally untouchable, and completely detached from the emotional carnage playing out in Atlanta. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I did not feel a shred of obligation. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back to absorb the warmth of the sun. I took a deep, deliberate breath, pulling the clean, salty air into my lungs. For the first time in my entire life, I exhaled without carrying the toxic, suffocating weight of my family. I was entirely, beautifully free. True power is never found in performative displays of wealth or the desperate approval of a toxic family. It is built on the unshakable foundation of your own independence. For too long, the illusion of loyalty demands that we sacrifice our peace to protect the fragile egos of those who manipulate us. Breaking free requires the profound courage to let the facades fall and allow the truth to echo loudly, even if it shatters the manufactured reality you once knew. Ultimately, your peace and self-respect are worth infinitely more than their comfort. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family dynamic to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more satisfying tales of ultimate vindication.